I'm WDET News Director Jerome Vaughn. Candidates for president and Congress are crisscrossing the state, and WDET will give you a chance to hear some different perspectives on what's happening in our second Smart Politics event. Join me at the Rind in Berkeley on July 10th to hear Canton Township Clerk Michael Segrist, communications expert Matt Friedman, and others. There's more info at WDET.org/events.
2024 political coverage on WDET is made possible in part by Ruby Duffield, Marianne, and Carl Fontana, and listeners like you.
This nation was founded on the principle that all men are created equal.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men
are
created equal.
I'll tell you what freedom is to me. No fear. I mean, really, no fear.
Created equal.
From WDET in Detroit, this is Created Equal with our weekly recap. I'm Stephen Henderson, and I'm joined by the producer of the show, Kerry Jr. II.
The weekly recap is back.
It's back.
We're here.
On a holiday week.
On a holiday
July 4th
week.
in the middle of it.
That is correct. Hopefully a lot of folks had some good barbecue in their bellies on Thursday.
That's right. That's exactly what you're supposed to be doing on that day. And in this recap, we're going to revisit conversations from this week that included some other discussions. One, the Pulitzer Prize-winning local report about missing Black women and girls in Chicago. We'll also listen to an episode where we talked about Canada's efforts to reconcile its past harms against Indigenous people in that country. And we'll also get the details on Michigan's new state budget and how it addresses economic opportunity. We're going to start, though, with Canada's efforts to confront that country's awful history with its Indigenous community. We spoke with Tricia Logan, a scholar and researcher.
We kind of delved briefly into their government-sponsored Indigenous residential schools. These residential schools were from 160 years government-sponsored institutions where they tried to assimilate Indigenous children into the European culture. They took them from their families in some cases. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created as a way to acknowledge, understand the history and the harms that were done to the Indigenous community in Canada, and then iron out specific action items and asks that the Canadian government can then carry out as a way to repair that harm. They've listed 94 items, and the Canadian government has been working to implement those items since 2015. So we talked with Logan about the residential schools, what took place in the residential schools, how that became part of the motivation for this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, detailing all those asks and comparing their efforts to confront their history with the U.S.'s efforts to confront its history with Indigenous Americans here.
Yeah, very different history there than we've had here. Dr. Logan, I want to talk more now about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. How was this supposed to work? What power was it given, and was it enough? Was it given sufficient purview and ability to actually address the things that had been done in the past?
That's a good question. It was from about 2008 or 2009 till 2015. That was the length of the mandate the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was given. And often that was one of the critiques and good critiques of how long of a mandate they were given and how much work there was to do, because it was hosting national gatherings across Canada and also regional smaller gatherings to record statements and testimonies, both privately, where survivors and intergenerational survivors and some former staff members could sit down and record their experience, their stories, their oral histories. And then also publicly, there were public forums at the national gatherings and regional gatherings to share publicly what happened, people's experiences and their thoughts, and kind of bridge those two parts of truth, sharing their truths and sharing what happened, as well as their vision for survivors' vision and Indigenous visions for what they thought reconciliation should be. And of course, the answer to that was very broad. Like, it was very individualistic almost. when asked that question, what do you see as reconciliation? Those answers were very broad. It was often about education and about letting the rest of Canada know about what happened in residential schools and what was happening broadly in Indigenous rights, and including that in school curriculum, like kindergarten to grade 12 curriculum, in university, post-secondary, in training professionals, in training public servants, in doctors and nurses, in legacies of colonial violence and residential schools, but also very connected structures of colonialism in Canada, like day schools and Indian hospitals and the child welfare system, and a series of kind of interlocked structures that were, this was at the core of it, about residential schools, but about a lot more Indigenous rights.
Yeah. So how much of what the commission was doing, or supposed to do, was about documenting the things that had happened before and making sure that, truth was brought to light about the nation's history, and then how much was about how to fix it, how to make things better for Indigenous people in the future?
It really was about striking that balance, about sharing the truths and having people hear the truths. As much as survivors were coming forward to share hours and hours, days of testimonies and oral histories and stories of often very traumatic, often very beautiful stories of strength and resistance and resilience. And in that, taking lessons from that strength and resistance and Indigenous resistance, and asking what next? Like, where do we want these calls to actions to go? And it's been now almost a decade since 2015, the 94 calls to action were released. And that's a lot of people's reflection on it, is how many things that were called upon, all the different major calls, major changes, how many things have happened, how many things have changed. And it's shifting that conversation. In May of 2021, in Kamloops to Secwepemc in British Columbia, there was a shift. The interim report on the findings in Kamloops on unmarked graves and missing children was released, and there was a different kind of public attention on all of the former sites of residential schools where there were unmarked burials and cemeteries. It kind of reignited a public Canadian broader conversation on, again, what happened at residential schools and what was being done, what kind of actions and reconciliation were being carried out or followed through, or those that weren't being done. That was as much as part of that conversation in acknowledging broader Indigenous rights battles for clean water, for land and resources, on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and a bigger conversation that we had to have in Canada.
Yeah. Okay, so Dr. Logan, this Truth and Reconciliation Commission goes through, documents all of these things that happen, and then comes up with what was going to happen as a result, right? What the country was going to do. Tell us what happens when they're finished and they decide to start trying to implement, or trying to get the government to implement this list of fixes.
I think the reaction was, at least from where I was, it was pretty broad. It was this kind of range of reactions, from no reaction at all to almost what in Canada has now manifested itself as denial of what happened, where there's kind of, bubbling up racism and hatred that fuels denial that says none of it happened at all, which is one side of it. And then there's another side of it where there were segments of municipal, local, provincial, and federal governments that genuinely took a look at the way they were operating in partnership with, or not in partnership with, First Nations and Métis and Inuit people in Canada, and they tore up their policies. They revised policies that they looked at me with honesty as someone who had worked with residential school survivors, and they said, I think some of these policies were pretty racist. And they were right, but then they were willing to have really hard conversations about, we need to revise them, we need to change them, we need to throw them out. And I met with public servants who said, I grew up in a little small town. There was a residential school in my town. I didn't really know what happened there. I had no idea. And I don't think what I've been doing for the last 30 years was pretty fair to Indigenous people. It was pretty awful. And I think I see why this requires change. This requires transformative change. And that's all. Sorry.
So did that transformative change take place? It sounds like there was momentum to get it done.
There was momentum. It was groups, and that's not all government. It's not all provinces. It didn't happen very evenly in all areas. Some areas, I also spoke to some people who kind of listened to those truths, listened about reconciliation, and just, they were never going to engage from the start.
Sure.
And there was never going to be buy-in. But I did also meet with local governments, especially with teachers, with all levels of teachers who really wanted to teach different histories, have different conversations in their classrooms, talk about human rights, talk about social justice, talk about the way that it opened up conversations to a much broader conversation about discrimination and anti-racism, and had a much broader reach, where the core of it really was about residential schools, but there was a way for engaging in often difficult conversations, really hard truths directly with survivors and elders and Indigenous communities, with the rest of Canada, with especially churches, church groups. I was asked to come speak at Mass. I was asked to speak to about these histories to church reading groups. There were lots of different kind of reconciliation reading groups that took up Indigenous authors and Indigenous literature, and learned about not just what happened in residential schools, but broadly about Indigenous rights and local things that, people would often come with that question. And it was a very genuine question, a very honest question. And often people kind of say, well, you have to do that work yourself. But they were good questions about, what can we do? Like, where do we start? There's 94 calls to action. And, what is the work that needs to be done? And I would often answer that with kind of reading them, reading.
That's right. Let's start there.
Learn about it. Learn about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Learn about the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And somewhere in there, in 94 calls, there's something that connects with everyone about language, about health, about education, about the law. There's something in there that connects with nearly everyone that they have their own interest in. And there is actions that everyone can, in a kind of that's kind of a pie in the sky view of it. But
yeah, there was something for everybody, really.
Apathy there was, apathy and hatred and negative responses, violent responses, but there was also very meaningful and very respectful, thoughtful responses that carry on today.
Yeah. So the commission concludes its mandate in 2015. So that's just 7 or 8 years after it was created. Was that essentially claiming victory and saying, well, we faced this, we fixed it, and we can move on? Or was it more just kind of saying, well, we don't think we can go any further than they have? Talk about why the mandate ended, and especially because there were more testimonies and reports that have come out since then about the things that have gone on in Canada.
That's true. There's still survivors and intergenerational survivors that come forward even today to say they want to sit down and record their story for the first time, that 10 years ago or 8-10 years ago, they weren't at a place that they were ready to speak about it. So those testimonies and truths are still coming up. But I think the message that came out at the time, at the end of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because they were funded with a mandate that would end in 2015. I think that what was presented from the commissioners, the 3 commissioners of the TRC, and by survivors was, this is a call. This is just the start. This is a call for transformative change. This is a call for change. And this is just the start of a conversation. And this is going to be decades. And a lot of the calls to action, some of them are worded that way, that they're looking at 7 generations ahead. They're also looking 7 generations before, but 7 generations ahead of us. And it's going to take generations of work to kind of undo or to try to resolve some of what was what happened during the residential school eras, and what had happened in that relationship between Canada, its churches, its corporations, and Indigenous peoples in Canada.
Yeah. What if the Truth and Reconciliation Commission were still around? If it hadn't concluded its work in 2015, do you think more would have changed? Do you think there would still be more momentum than there is now?
The end of the commission kind of marked a time where they again made a call, 94 calls, and put this in the hands of not just Indigenous communities, but Canada, its churches, its corporations, to do that work, to do the hard work. And I think that survivors, especially survivors of residential school, Indigenous nations, keep carrying that message forward, and often kind of meet frustration because now there's a reflection back to 2015 on what was like. There's good critiques on what was reconciliation meant to do. Was that reconciliation? Because without justice, there's still violence. There's still massive resource extraction, water. Like there's still removal of Indigenous presence from Canada, and there's kind of a very realistic conversation about, is reconciliation even possible? Is it even possible without? You have to lead with truth. You have to lead with justice, and without that, people say there's kind of precursors. There's kind of a lot of work that has to be done before they even enter into a conversation about reconciliation. And that led into a conversation now about what happened in 2021, the start of kind of knowing more about the unmarked burials and grave sites, where there's now an Office of the Special Interlocutor on Missing Children and Unmarked Burials in Canada, that they've initiated national and regional gatherings across Canada to investigate. They hired an interlocutor to investigate what happened, and an Office of the Interlocutor to investigate and gather records. And so it's also survivors and Indigenous communities asking for more accountability and more justice of what happened to missing children and to what happened at residential schools. So it carries on. It has a different kind of momentum and a different kind of meaning to especially the children who didn't make it home. And we're looking at the records that are required, the research. Some nations are leading that research on their own, on ground penetrating radar into the unmarked burials and the grave sites. And that will take, in some cases, decades for some of that research and work.
That was Tricia Logan, a scholar and researcher who is an expert on Indigenous people in Canada. Coming up next, we're going to revisit our deep dive into the newly funded Michigan state budget. We will be right back with more Created Equal. Welcome back to Created Equal. I'm Stephen Henderson, joined by Carrie Jr. II. Next up, we are going to listen back to a show where we talked deeply, really, about the state budget, which was passed by the July 1st deadline. We talked about how this budget reprioritizes and funds economic opportunity.
Yeah, and there were a lot of proposed items in that budget that did make it and didn't make it. And I think what we would assume would happen, because we have Democratic governor, Democratic legislature, a lot of their plans would get through easily, and that's not the case. There's a lot of money involved, and trying to allocate that appropriately was always going to be a challenge for them. So we had two guests on and to talk about it, and you three, y'all weren't really specific during this conversation.
Yeah, we took a kind of deep dive on a number of different fronts: education, assistance to families who are impoverished. We talked about healthcare, and in all of those realms, this budget really does some different things than we've seen in the past. Those were things that Governor Gretchen Whitmer tried to really outline in her budget address back in February. The question was whether the legislature, which is also controlled by Democrats, would go along, and they really did with a large number of them. We talked with Alethea Casben, who is the managing editor at Gongwer News Service in Lansing. And we also had Colin Jackson with us. He's a reporter at the Michigan Public Radio Network. They are both great journalists who have been paying a lot of attention to the budget wranglings in Lansing. Okay, I want to dive a little more into some things that we were expecting, I guess, to be in the state budget, or there was a possibility that they would be in the state budget that we didn't quite get. Paid family leave. That's an issue that has come up several times in the past in Lansing. We've been talking about it for a while. I think some people thought this might be the year where we would get that kind of relief for people. We didn't see it in this budget. Colin Jackson, I'll start with you. What happened to that proposal?
It didn't get done simply enough. This is something that had been a priority for Democrats that we have seen talked about. But at the end of the day, when it comes to budgets, there's always going to be bargaining chips. There's going to be things that go by the wayside, and this was one of them.
Yeah. Alethea Casben, this was something that a lot of groups in the state were hoping would come together this year. Talk about where we are with that issue and why we're having such a hard time with it.
You know, there's a lot of tension around that issue. I think we hear Democratic leaders generally support it, right? I mean, you talk to the House Speaker, the Senate Majority Leader, and they're generally open to this idea. Paid family leave is a popular Democratic idea, but it comes down to the details and it comes down to the money, right? And we haven't really heard any serious public discussion. We haven't had a committee hearing. We haven't seen an analysis on cost or how it would be structured. So this really hasn't been given any serious airtime other than to say, like, this would be a good idea. Maybe Michigan should do it. I wouldn't say it is necessarily dead, but I would think if this was going to happen, it would be more of a lame duck December 2024 proposal. Mm-hmm. But there's a good chance it could not happen at all. I mean, business groups really don't like this. They don't like the idea of paying more. This idea of sort of structuring this like a new sort of tax, kind of like unemployment. They're really opposed. So there's going to be fierce opposition to this if it ever gets serious consideration. And that'll make, Democrats a little nervous too.
Yeah. What about pre-K? There was no universal pre-K that got passed in Lansing this time, but we did see some changes to eligibility and the participation requirement. That's another issue that we've been talking about for quite some time, and there are, of course, places that have universal pre-K. We're not one of them. Alethea, what's going on there?
Yeah, so universal pre-K, they upped the income threshold. So it was 300% of the poverty level. They upped it to 400% of the poverty level, which is about $120,000 for a family of four. Democrats say this will cover a lot of families that need this, and bring 5,000 more kids into the system. While they didn't do universal pre-K, there was a secondary income threshold. So basically, once all the slots are filled, if you make 100% more, so maybe 500% of the income level, you could then come into the program. They got rid of that. So now, if a program is serving everyone under the 400% income threshold, anyone else can come in if they have room. So it's not universal pre-K, but it is maybe a step and a half toward it versus, just a step or half a step. Yeah. So they're certainly making strides in that direction. The concern among Democratic lawmakers is the infrastructure there. They don't want to open up universal pre-K and then there's not enough teachers, there's not enough classrooms. So someone goes to enroll their kid and they're told, technically there is universal pre-K. We still don't have it here.
But we don't have room for you, right? Colin, again, this is one of those kind of bread and butter democratic issues that that a lot of advocacy has kind of developed behind. Talk about why we can't get to the finish line there. It seems like there are incremental changes every once in a while, but not ever getting it done.
I mean, I think the simplest way to put it is universal pre-K is going to be an expensive program for the state. Mm-hmm. This is something that Governor Gretchen Whitmer has mentioned, and I believe her past few State of the State addresses, she's called on the legislature now repeatedly to get it done. At the same time, though, there's only so much money to pay for these types of things. So as Alethea mentioned, this budget did expand that from 300% of the federal poverty guidelines to about 400%. At the same time, it's a matter of finding the money in the budget. One of the things was what we were talking about earlier, this reduction in the school's per pupil funding allowance, or rather the lack thereof increase in per pupil funding and foundation allowances. Some of that money is going to go toward the universal pre-K expansion, the Great Start Readiness Program. At the same time, though, there wasn't enough to finish the job. And this is something where I think, again, Democrats and possibly Republicans as well, there's some support for the idea in theory, but when you actually get down to the nitty-gritty details, it's going to take a lot more work than I think lawmakers were able to do.
Okay, I want to go back to the K-12 budget and talk about what some of the consequences might be for the decisions that lawmakers made. Things are pretty tight in a lot of school districts that are used to more flush, I guess, financial circumstances. I mean, in places like Grosse Pointe, for instance, things are pretty tight, and they're talking about shortfalls that they haven't had to deal with in the past. Are layoffs and things that would affect instruction in the classroom on the table? Are these things that Michiganders are going to see happen when their kids go back to school in the fall? Colin, I'll start with you.
Well, this is something where education groups are raising the alarm. They say more needs to be done, and they're really crossing their fingers for a supplemental budget to spend a little bit more towards schools. The Michigan Education Association had released a press release after the budget passed, basically saying that they appreciate the reduction in the retirement contributions. At the same time, they're saying that schools are in trouble. They're saying that they're pointing to some of the deeper cuts in this budget, like to school safety and mental health, which was reduced significantly. And yes, this could have some potential impact. Now, it depends on who you ask. There are some Democrats in the legislature that supported this budget that say it's possible to have your cake and eat it too, that this wouldn't be the same disaster for schools that some school and education advocates are saying it could be. That remains to be seen. But the fact of the matter right now, though, is, and you had alluded to this earlier, Democrats who supported this budget and schools seem to be at odds, at least a little bit, when it came down to the implications this could have.
Alethea, we have this kind of strange system of funding schools in Michigan that we keep saying is going to eventually result in some sort of equity between wealthy districts and poorer districts. It seems that we can never quite get to that space, though, because fundamentally, the way we fund schools comes up short, and we have so many pressures on the dollars that we send to schools. But things like legacy costs, pensions for instructors, which is a really important priority too. But the tensions between that and the things that would more directly affect kids in the classroom, it seems like we can't get past all of that to get to this space where we're dealing with a level playing field, I guess, between all districts.
Right. And I think, on the level playing field front, this budget does still try to fund students that they call at-risk students who are a little bit more expensive to educate. And that's what really drives sort of this inequity problem, right? Some districts that are wealthier might have students who are just maybe less expensive to educate, while the poorer districts don't have that same landscape. So there is funding, to increase special education, to increase at risk for students who need more. So they did still, even though there's not a per pupil increase, they did still do that. And I do want to touch on the layoff question too, because that, is incredibly complex. You guys talked about this at the beginning of the show. The last few years, there has been a ton of federal money going into schools, and that, is over. COVID has, at least from the government standpoint, officially ended. So they're not seeing, a ton of extra federal money, and that will have an impact. So even before this budget was finalized, talks of layoffs, were already happening. A lot of districts used this federal money to maybe up staff, whether it was teachers or support staff or things like that. And they just can't really keep it going in some places. So layoffs were already part of the conversation.
That was Alethea Casbin, managing editor at Gongwer in Lansing, and Colin Jackson, a reporter at the Michigan Public Radio Network. Coming up next, we are going to listen back to a conversation about how questionable police practices have led to a disproportionate number of missing Black women and girls in Chicago. Welcome back to Created Equal. I'm Stephen Henderson, joined by Carrie Jr. II, our show's producer. Weekly recap. We still need a theme for that.
We do need a theme for that. But on a more serious note, we have to get into a really groundbreaking report, local report that came out of Chicago, with a Pulitzer Prize winning report that we talked about during this week. It's about missing girls in Chicago. We spoke to two reporters on it. It was senior reporter Sarah Conway out of the City Bureau and journalist and data director at the Invisible Institute, Trina Reynolds Tyler. They collaborated on a report where they sifted through about 340,000 records, missing persons cases, to find that Black women and girls were disproportionately represented in those cases. And it uncovered a lot more, not only about just those missing cases, but about Chicago's police department and how they responded to missing persons reports.
Yeah, I mean, the key here is the relationship between the police response and the problem itself. A lot of these missing persons incidences end up as murders, in part because the police aren't responding in an emergent enough way to get involved before they end up with someone losing their lives. The depth of the reporting, the breadth of the reporting here is really incredible. And of course, it's a problem that just scares you to nearly to death. I mean, the idea that if someone in your family went missing and you went to the police to get help, you would be told that they couldn't help or that they wouldn't help. And perhaps that would end up in your loved one losing their life. This is a really dark subject, and these two reporters did a really great job documenting it. So, Trina, I want to start with you and have you talk about how you started investigating missing person cases with the human rights data analysis and the pattern that that emerged from that.
Yeah, so when I've been at the Invisible Institute for 8 years, and in 2018, I went to grad school to get my master's in public policy at the University of Chicago. I was already interested in missing persons cases, and specifically at the Invisible Institute, I lead a project called Beneath the Surface, which interrogates the intersection between gender-based violence and policing. So I knew I wanted to use technology to parse through public records to tell stories. And when I interned at the Human Rights Data Analysis Group in 2019, I brought with me a FOIA request. It was like a document that had a data frame on it, and it was all open missing persons cases up into for about 16 years. And I learned how to scrape that PDF. That was one of the first PDFs I learned how to scrape using R, which is a programming software. Fast forward to 2020, at the Invisible Institute called Beneath the Surface, we use machine learning to parse through police, narrative text under police misconduct records. And one of the groupings of complaints that were identified in our process was a set of 54 allegations of misconduct against Chicago police relating to missing persons cases. And that was like neglect of missing persons cases, like disrespect to parents, all the way to premature closure of a case, even though someone had not been found. And at that point, that's when I reached out to Sarah Conway, and this partnership began.
Okay, so I want to talk more specifically about what you guys found in the investigation and what the scope of the project was. But I want to start with just some harrowing numbers. 70% of the missing persons in Chicago are African American. 57% of them are Black children. And 30% of them are Black girls between the ages of 10 and 20. I mean, it's really hard just to even fathom those kinds of numbers. Sarah, can you tell us more about what's going on there and what you guys learned?
We found in our investigation that the missing persons crisis in Chicago disproportionately impacts Black Chicagoans. As you mentioned, Black people do make up about 2/3 of all missing persons cases in Chicago. And while the Chicago Police Department has claimed that the services for families are equal and fair across race and zip codes, we found that there are not only massive data gaps that make it really hard to prove that through the Chicago Police Department's own data, but we did interviews with families over 2 years, police officials, public officials, and people who are working with missing persons families in the city to show a different pattern, one that is really rooted in neglect, the delay and denial of missing persons cases that has led to the murders of Black women and girls in the city, as well as a whole array of illegal behaviors from police officers in their dealing with missing persons cases. One of our early findings that really showed up in the misconduct data that was really a rock to our investigation was that, under Illinois law and Chicago police policy, police officers cannot deny or tell anyone to wait any amount of time before filing a missing persons report. However, when we talked to Black families, we often heard that they were being told to wait, sometimes 24 to 48 hours, or that they were, there was police officers would imply that, a loved one was out with a boyfriend or that she had run away, that there was some reason to explain the missingness, and in turn, police, denying the family a missing persons report. Another core finding of our investigation was that we families felt in general that police were really dismissive of them and their loved ones. Oftentimes they felt that, police would kind of hyper focus on an area of their loved one's life. For instance, their age, imply that, the loved one was somehow that they were missing because of substance use disorder or another public health issue that the family might be dealing with. And that in turn, that bias would lead to police conducting slower investigations, collecting less evidence or losing evidence, and oftentimes leaving the weight of the investigation on the family itself. We would hear from Black families that they had to garner their own resources, to find people on their block to go out and look for their loved ones when they were missing. And the detectives were not there with them.
Wow.
We also saw in, and I want to pass to Trina to kind of dive into police data, but our analysis of police data over 2 decades really had us call into the department's data keeping practices. We found out that the missing persons form is one of the last paper-based forms that the Chicago Police Department is using. And using that, which requires them to then input it by hand into their digital system, we found that would delay the assignment of detectives, and that in, police records from 2017 to 2021, police were missing 45% of a key data point, just about the time and the date that police would even arrive to investigate missing persons cases. And so we also found in doing our own analysis, which required us gathering records from, the medical examiner in Cook County, looking at homicide data that the Chicago Police Department had, comparing that with news reports and other missing persons police data that we had, that there were multiple cases that ended in homicide that were marked as non-criminal in CPD's own data, which means that police were handling missing persons cases that ultimately resulted in a homicide that this individual ended up being murdered. But in the police's data, it looked as if there was no crime actually associated to the missing persons case, which we believe, poses a question about that, the police department's data keeping practices in general, the integrity of them.
Yeah. Trina, Sarah was talking about the data here and how it's kept, how it's not kept, the integrity of it. I thought maybe you could talk more about what you found and how hard it was, I guess, to piece this together because of that.
Absolutely. So in order to really get us started, we have to go back in time to 2017, where there was a city council public safety meeting and folks were up in arms. They were asking law enforcement, city council members in this specific committee were asking law enforcement, what's going on with missing Black girls? And CPD officials went up and said, between 2000 and 2016, nearly all of the juveniles who went missing were returned or were located. Now, at the time that he said that statistic, no one dig deeper into what he meant with, what he meant by those stats. In our reporting, we found that, the time period that he was referencing included 2 cases of Black teenage girls who were murdered, but law enforcement officers wrote in the paperwork, missing has been located, victim offender of a crime, no. In the case of Shavonna Prather, for example, she was murdered in April of 2002. And early in the day of April 26th, law enforcement wrote in the paper, missing has been located, spoke with the complainant, missing located, victim offender of a crime, no. Like 2 or 3 hours later, her body was actually found in the hundreds of Chicago. She had been deceased for days. Wow. And that's confusing, right? It's like, well, so what happened here? How did this law enforcement write in a paper and believe this person was located when they actually weren't. And then we fast forward to the year 2016, young person Desiree Robinson, who, was reported missing November 29th. On December 20th, law enforcement wrote in an article, in their underlying reports, missing was located, victim or offender of a crime. No. At the time, she was actually being sex trafficked. And 4 days later, she was murdered. Her body was found. So yes, technically she was found 4 days after they closed her case, and she had been murdered. And so it calls the question, were they ever looking for her in the first place? Right. And so those two cases in the data are labeled as non-closed, non-criminal, which is like, it says incident closed, not criminal in nature. If you look at their underlying documents, it looks like the law enforcement agent talked to the family and that the missing was found and that they were totally fine, when in fact they had not been. And so when we receive a sea of records, nearly 100% of them labeled as closed non-criminal, meaning person found and incident not criminal in nature, it makes us question the integrity of the data. It makes us dig even deeper. And so from that, aside from even identifying cases where we identified 4 cases in total where officers falsely alleged that the person had been found, even though they had not been. We also identified 11 homicides that were labeled in the data as closed non-criminal, even though a homicide investigation had opened in connection to the case, and even though it was very clear that when that person was found, they had died by homicide. When you look at the missing persons data, if I were to pull the data from the past 2 decades, again, it would say nearly 100% of them are closed non-criminal, and it would actually show you a handful of cases that become later associated with a crime. And in that database, you see 10 cases that were missing persons cases and became homicides. You see the case of Joanna Wright, who was initially a missing person, and her case became a kidnapping because information was later learned that she was kidnapped. You would even see instances of sexual assault, right? Someone who was missing, and then they later learned that this person had experienced a sexual assault, right? So the case went from non-criminal to criminal. But when we did that digging, like I said earlier, we were actually able to find 11 additional homicides on top of the 10. And, the issue there is that when you're looking at the data, everything is one big glob, and it makes it's one big mass of obscured information ultimately, right? It is a sea of cases, over 344,000 of them, where Chicago police cannot tell us whether or not, how many people were found alive, how many people were found dead, nor can they actually, do they have a process that is dependable to verify that a law enforcement officer has actually found the person. And so when you couple that with dismissive attitudes that law enforcement have around missing persons cases, you end up with cases like Desiree Robinson, where officers were thinking, well, I'm sure she'll come back.
She'll show up.
I'm sure she'll come back. And but actually, she was being sex trafficked at the time. And had her body not been found, we would not even know that, we would not even know that she was a missing and murdered person.
So that was our conversation with Trina Reynolds Tyler, the data director at the Invisible Institute, and Sarah Conway, a reporter at the City Bureau. And what they were saying there is so hard to kind of wrap your mind around, this idea that because a missing person turned up dead, they actually knew more about the fact that they were missing, because the police wouldn't look into the fact that they were missing. I mean, it is a harrowing problem, and it is so deeply ingrained in the culture, I think, of not just the Chicago police, but police departments in many places, that it's hard to know in some ways how to fix that.
Yeah, and it's that miscategorizing that can make it really hard. It was hard for them to really understand what was happening to these missing persons, the missing women there. So that's an ongoing, I imagine, investigation, and they're putting in those efforts to they are, and the city is putting in efforts to try and get a better process going so that they can properly categorize and find and identify and process these missing person cases.
You got to take this stuff seriously. And if we're ever going to have the African American community in particular have faith in the police and in policing, you've got to change that culture. You've got to change that reaction to the call for help, to say, hey, something's going on and I need the police to figure it out. That should trigger a compassionate response. That should trigger an investigative response. In this case, in too many cases in Chicago, it just doesn't. That's it for Created Equal. You can listen to recent episodes at WDET.org and make sure to subscribe to our podcast, where you can leave us a rating or a review. Created Equal is produced by Carrie Jr. II and David Lyons. The audio editing is by Connor Anderson, and the music is by Sam Bobian. Created Equal is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University.